Good afternoon, everyone. Treasure Troller here. Welcome to another edition of the Murder Book. Today's episode, we are in Ludington, Michigan, and we're outside the Grand, which is a bar and restaurant here in Ludington. And in 1958, it was the scene of a murder. In fact, it was the very first officer that was killed on duty in Mason County. Mason County has been around for 166 years. They've only had two officers that were on duty that were killed. The Arlo Slagle, today's vlog, was the very first. The other one was Officer Paul Butterfield, and I'll provide a link in the description below concerning his murder. It was 1958, and it was July 19th, the very late July 19th, and really into the 20th, when this murder occurred. And it occurred here at the Grand, which is still a bar and restaurant here in Ludington. It looks very similar to when it did back in 1958. So what happened was a couple gentlemen from Chicago, the names are Benjamin Davis and Charles Hanna, had entered the Grand, and they were looking for a waitress by the name of Jane Clark. Now, Benjamin and Charles Hanna were from Chicago, and Jane had lived and worked in Chicago, and around the very beginning of 1956 is when she met Benjamin Davis. And around Easter of 1958, she moved back to Ludington with her 7-year-old daughter and moved in with her parents. Well, Benjamin wanted to come back and try to convince Jane to come back to Chicago. Now, looking into it a little bit, it seems like before the event, they say that Benjamin and Chuck had entered the bar around 11 o'clock that night. And it seems from what I was reading, they'd actually met Jane earlier that evening. Now, it could have been they met her here, but they met Jane here. She wasn't working officially, but she was helping out. The owner, the proprietor, told her to go home and to kind of officially come on the clock. And I think Benjamin and Chuck took her home so she could change into her uniform. And then, sorry about that, they brought her back and Jane started working. That was around 10:40 at night, and they were sitting in the bar, and it had been a couple of hours, and Benjamin called Jane over to the table that they were at, and he took a bullet out, and according to Jane and her testimony, she said, "Benny showed me a bullet and says, 'This has your name on it.'" And that was, and Chuck pulled back his coat and showed me a gun in his belt. So Benjamin had told her, "If you don't come back to Chicago with me, this bullet has your name on it." Well, she took the bullet, gave it to the other waitress, and she in turn told the bar owner that there is a problem with a couple of guys here at the bar, and he walked down to the police station and told them what was going on. Now, the police station was actually right around this corner here. We've almost made it to the station. I don't like showing buildings that don't exist anymore, but I just wanted you to kind of give you a sense of the distance. And the police station was kind of right down at this corner of this building here, down here, so maybe a block away. So 2 police officers and Arlo, Officer Slagle, so there's 3 of them, showed up at the bar. One went over to Benjamin and was kind of handling him. Officer Slagle and another police officer went over to get Chuck Hanna. They both had him. Now, I'm not sure, it doesn't really say if the officers knew he had a gun, but they got on both sides of Hanna, and as Slagle started to frisk him, they were holding him by the arms, and as Officer Slagle started frisking him, well, he pulled away from them, and both officers they all kind of fell onto the floor, and Officer Slagle was, I don't really quite understand how it actually had, the bullet ended up in the ceiling, because they say that Hanna was sort of crouching when he shot, but anyways, he shot Officer Slagle in the chest and started heading out the door before he took a couple of billy club hits to the head. But anyways, Officer Slagle's shot was fatal, and he died on the floor of the Grand. Now, Benjamin and Chuck, they drove here, and the car was still here. So they thought that Chuck Hanna had taken off on foot. So as they sort of rounded up the patrolmen and people to help track down Hanna, they were setting up some roadblocks. They were also kind of looking around the streets, looking in down the railroad tracks and stuff. But what had actually happened was Chuck had ran down the street here. We're not going to go all the way down. We'll go into the parking lot, but he had ran down the street to the very end, and he found the keys in a car, and he took the car. And so by the time really law enforcement had got around and formed the posse, the search crew, within 10 minutes, Hanna was already out of town, halfway out of the county. He had spent a day there from Chicago. He spent a day in the Chicago area in another nearby town, and he was going to head south. He'd picked up a couple of hitchhikers, and they headed south, and he tried to pawn, they must have ran out of money fairly quick. They were trying to pawn a tire off the car for a very more than reasonable price. And the gas station attendant was a little suspicious of a guy with a pretty nice car who was very disheveled and muddy, and was willing to part ways with a tire for about $3.50. So they got a hold of he got a hold of the local police, and Chuck was picked up in Valdosta, Georgia, on the Georgia-Florida line, brought back here to Ludington to stand trial. And he was found guilty. He was given a 20 to 40 year sentence for the murder of Officer Slagle. His friend, Benjamin Davis, received I would call it almost a misdemeanor charge of having a gun in a vehicle. Trying to give you an idea. Let's see. But it was down there. You can kind of see that brown. So that brown building there, whoops. That brown building is the end of the street here, and it starts downwind, and that's where he had stole the car and took off out of town. So his friend, like I said, he had testified for the prosecution, Benjamin Davis. He was charged with basically having a weapon in the car. According to some of the article, when they came up here to talk to Jane, or to get Jane, and I think it was when they were taking her back to her house to get her uniform, is when Benjamin presented her with a gift, and that was a gun. And that gun was left in the car. That was the one that Benjamin Davis had received his sentence for. So Chuck Hanna had received a 20 to 40 year sentence. He served 12 years of that sentence. There were some legal wranglings with confession and right to counsel and privileged conversations and whatnot. And so he was basically sentenced to time served, which was 12 years. So a little bit about Arlo before we go to his grave. He grew up not too far from here, outside of Scottville, on a farm. And after graduation, he was working at a factory. Actually, it wouldn't have been too far from here, right up around that corner, a couple of blocks from here. He worked there, and he worked part-time as a Ludington police officer. He served in the United States Army. He was a tank driver during the Korean War, and he was injured in battle. He had taken shrapnel to the leg. He was given the Purple Heart. He came back to Ludington, and he was working again back at the factory, part-time as a patrolman here for the city of Ludington. He was married and had 2 young children. So now we will go to the grave of Officer Arlo Slagle. So this is the final resting place of Officer Arlo Slagle. He was a husband, father, served in the military, fought for our country in the Korean War, a Purple Heart recipient. 27 years old. So for the murder book, this is Treasure Troller saying aloha and good day.